Now I'd like to call upon Professor Cecile BRICE, who will be talking about From Conceptualization to Slogan, When Science Becomes a Tool of Politics, the Case of Management of Migratory Flows in a Nuclear Catastrophe. Well, that is a different title than what's indicated on the slide, and that happens with many of you, but in any case, that doesn't matter. Please go ahead.
Bonjour. フランス国立科学研究
Good morning. My name is Cecile BRICE from CNRS. Would like to add some information. I'd like to apologize for that because I have made some revision. I have prepared the Japanese translation myself. I believe there are some mistakes in my Japanese version. I'd like to apologize for that.
Allow me to do presentation in English. So I just read my script.
So my title is From Atomic Fission to Spreading Areas of Expertise, When Politics Prevails Over Scientific Proof. Hiroshima is everywhere, wrote Gunther Anders, and everything suggests that despite all manner of humanist discourse, mankind has not yet chosen that it be any other way. During the commemoration of 70th anniversaries of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe omitted a key phrase from his speech in homage to the victims, namely the three principles of nuclear non-proliferation reaffirmed each year by his predecessors, will not possess, produce, or import nuclear weapons. The omission was no mere oversight, for his government has just made a unilateral decision to revise the constitution so as to allow for Japan to carry out military operations abroad, as well to facilitate nuclear agreements on the commercial side. We will very likely be accused of confusing two distinct notions. That means nuclear energy and nuclear weaponry, as if passing from a civil to a military function will change its fundamental nature. A review of the history of the nuclear industry's beginnings, though, will quickly dispel such naive arguments. And of course, it must be remembered that it is from our peaceful uranium plants that the military is able to acquire its plutonium. That it is in fact the same entity is reinforced by the government's action. The drive to pave the way for Japan's return to armed conflict has been accompanied simultaneously by a concerted effort to put the Fukushima disaster into the past and as quickly as possible, capitalizing on the fact that although the effects of the catastrophe are still being dealt with, the menace is more and more familiar. Even annoying present, the government made the decision to resume operations at the Sendai nuclear plant on Kyushu on August this year. But irrationality and contradiction that strain belief also play a large role in nuclear matters, as evidenced by another change in government policy. Just as an important international study announced its results showing a clear link between leukemia and long-term exposure to low-dose radiation, the Japanese government, with the support of the IAEA, increased the acceptable dose for nuclear workers from 100 millisievert per year to 250 millisievert per year in cases of emergency. It is worth recalling that his name norm had been set at 20 millisievert per year, prior to the explosion at Fukushima Daiichi, and was then raised following the accident to 100 millisievert per year for nuclear workers and 20 millisievert per year for civilian population. Because this threshold is used as the basis for all measures protecting and managing the population, its importance surpasses the purely epidemiological domain to have multiple and wide-ranging consequences. The first is the increase by the authorities of the radiation dose considered acceptable for the general population, despite all the epidemiological evidence signaling the grave health risks of an environment below 100 millisievert per year. The political authorities are henceforth using this as a basis of reference so as to stabilize the benchmark for the whole of the population at 20 millisievert per year. Other consequences appear in civil protection policies, since it is this threshold that is used to determine which zones should be evacuated for their health hazards and which not. From there derives the totality of measures for protecting residents, most notably the housing policy, by which a government can control the movements of its population and where it is settled. The epidemiologic effects of nuclear exposure, I call this Even INWORKS, doesn't work. Maybe you know that an international cohort study called INWORKS, that means International Nuclear Workers Study, on ionizing radiation and risk of death from leukemia and lymphoma in radiation monitored workers, was undertaken to dispel the uncertainties regarding the connection of these diseases to protected exposure to low doses radiation. This study, carried out by 13 researchers in epidemiology, each from a different laboratory, was made public in June this year. This study consisted of following no less than 300,000 workers who had been employed in a nuclear facility for the last 1 year in France by the Atomic Energy Commission, Areva Nuclear Cycle, or the National Electricity Company. In the USA, by the Departments of Energy and Defense, and the UK by nuclear industry employers listed in the National Registry for Radiation Workers. For its part, the study carried out by the team of INWORKS researchers proved the correlation between the risk of death from leukemia and prolonged exposure to low doses of radiation through the monitoring of the subjects over a period of 60 years. But since nothing stops those who insist on applying the risk-benefit norm, which called ALARA, as low as reasonably acceptable, they, I mean ICRP, continue to argue. We don't know scientifically what the health effects are of low levels of radioactivity, even if in reality we know. So we must just deal with the situation on the ground. The key, therefore, is not to find a way to teach what one does not know. This says a lot about the weight given to the simple communication in the matter. Communicating does not equal informing. Communications amounts the inculcation through public relations, propaganda, the goal of which is to make people accept a doctrine that has been politically, but not scientifically, established. To go as low as reasonably possible also means, according to Jacques Lochard, speaking at a June this year symposium of the ethics of radio protection, that The right of refuge could not be one of the radio protection rules. We have to accept the situation and deal with it. Deborah Hawthorne from CIRAT added that we must educate people as to the risk in order to make the risk more acceptable. What's important is to know by whom this risk must be accepted and why. Without waiting any longer, the Japanese government first announced the near total reopening of the evacuation zone to habitation for 2017, which means the end of the policy of housing allocation, the only one in place for refugees, and began by reauthorized for the first time part of the full evacuation zone to be habitable once more. The town of Nahara thus reopened its door in September this year. Fewer than 10% of the municipality's 7,100 residents applied to return to the town, which lacks the basic commercial and medical services. About the psychological effects of nuclear energy, it's a point of no return. We established a first assessment in December 2014 of the number of victims of this management of the crisis, as disastrous as the disaster itself, according for 1,117 deaths related to the explosion at the TEPCO nuclear plant. Contradicting the rumors circulated by some researchers, notably at the Fukushima Medical University, according to which cases of depression and suicide had multiplied within the refugee population due to their estrangement from their hometowns. A recent study led by Professor Takuya Tsujiuclui, director of the Waseda Institute of Medical Anthropology on Disaster Reconstruction, on 16,000 refugees, show that over 40% of them suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. This result further indicated that the number of traumatized individuals was equivalent between those who'd been ordered to evacuate and those who took refuge voluntarily. Professor Tsujiuclui, interviewed by the national broadcaster NHK on May this year, explained that to constrain these people to return to live in the place where the psychological disorder began, while its environments remain unstable due to current contamination levels and the decaying state of the nuclear plant, could have dramatic consequences. He points out that, in contrast to the results of post-traumatic testing following an earthquake, this study shows that the victims are not confronted by a single stress in managing their everyday lives, but suffer from genuine mortal anguish faced with the nuclear menace. According to Professor Tsujiuclui, we act today as though the catastrophe is over, but that is not the case. We are cutting housing aid and then indemnities for psychological suffering. Then financial compensation for loss of belongings. Soon there will be no more aid, and the situation is very, very dangerous. What about the residential effects of nuclear exposure? Because housing is life. By the way, the policy of reconstruction is advancing very, very slowly. The number of public housing units actually built on the refuge site is just around 500 out of the around 5,000 that were planned. Yet despite 3 calls for applications, the occupation rate for these 500 units remains very linked. The principal reason for this resistance comes from the fact that the prospective inhabitants will not only lose their current rent-free arrangement, but they would have to live in collective housing. For this population, who were mostly farmers consuming the fruits of their own production, to accept such housing would mean entering into a costly system of consumption that they had always avoided. Worse, in doing so, they will definitively give up hope of ever living again in a rich natural environment, as had been theirs. The words of Mrs. Monma, a 75-year-old Buddhist priest from the town of Namie, put this in clear terms. We simply want houses where we can farm the land. The remarks of Ulrich Beck come to mind. Risk society informally place humanity in situations where it puts itself in danger through the intermediary of civilization. This example shows how his process of self-destruction is set up in our societies, which nonetheless continue to boast of their level of civilization achieved through the development of the system of economic production that sustains them. Like what the Japanese government's call for a return to life in the contaminated areas, all the while refusing the massive investment needed to reconstruct the depopulated countryside, an area that it had in fact already abandoned in favor of urban economic viability. Lies and punishment. As we have seen through various angles of approach, the disconnect between reality and political acts in this is deepening, so a philosophical approach to the problem is needed if we are to understand and thus better confront the cause of such commitment to this self-destructive behavior. What is the reality here? The reality is scientific proof of the dangers of nuclear radiation, even at low doses. The demonstration that social management of such an accident is impossible, no matter the level of wealth or education of the country involved. Japan, in instance. Confirmation of the fact that nuclear energy is not economically cost-effective, and which had and scientific confirmation that nuclear energy is not the perfect solution to reducing CO2 emissions, since it itself produced them, as for example during the extraction and processing of uranium. Therefore, nuclear production is not necessary in the philosophical sense of the term. That means what is and must not to be to life in our societies. It should also be noted that we possess today other means of meeting our energy needs, the performance of which could be rapidly increased if our governments decided to devote even a quarter of the budget that now goes to developing nuclear research. Finally, our energy consumption could be considerably lessened if we address the wastefulness at the industrial level as much as among individuals that characterize the modes of overconsumption in the rich countries of our planet. What therefore are the motivation of those who, counter to all good sense, make the decision to pursue and develop a form of energy that holds the ultimate power of to be or not to be? I call it when the deaths of some become a bull market for the others. As we noted in previous article, Mitsubishi, the prince of Japanese home automation and electric cars, having expanded into the armament industry, participated for the first time in 2014 in the International Armament Exhibition, Irrationality. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries created a joint venture with Areva under the name Atmea, beginning in 2007, with the goal of developing cells of the European pressurized reactor and the advanced pressurized water reactor. On May 2013, Turkish Prime Minister and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe signed a $22 million contract to construct the Sinop nuclear power plant in Turkey. The owners of the power plant are Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Itochu for Japan, who together with the French Areva and GDF Suez account for 65%, and the Turkish public energy producer with 35%. Political instability in the region can only increase our anxiety regarding the resolve of the Japanese to do what is needed to join with the various countries of the coalition to intervene militarily against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. This military action, primarily undertaken by the Americans, involved 21 other countries, including France and the other principal countries of Europe, but also Canada, one of the world's primary sources of uranium. This war on an arms market without end. For example, in February this year, France sold 24 Rafale fighter planes to Egypt, 34 to India, 10 to Qatar, decided to buy 24 itself for a total of over 6 billion euros. To make matters worse, the use of weapons and munitions containing depleted uranium in these various conflicts has yet to be regulated. The US, UK, France, and Israel all rejected a United Nations resolution on the matter in October last year. From the illusion of citizens participating to shaking the democratic system, and it will be my conclusion. Nuclear industrialists thus assume an untenable right, and by doing so, unleash an imperative of responsibility that is much too heavy to be borne by its holders alone. It's the reason that the nuclear sector introduced the participative system, so that rather than minimizing the risks, it ensures that they are accepted, and even that the responsibility for them is shared by giving the parties concerned the illusion that they participate in the decision-making process. But another characteristic of the nuclear industry is that its increased stature, which is purely a product of public policy, enables it to effectively ignore the opposing masses to which it accords but a semblance of meaningful involvement. This dictatorial nature is inherent in the nuclear establishment, which makes a mockery of the democratic system, pushing it to the other edges. As we can see in this picture, taken last year in October, where the Japanese government was deciding to restart the country's first nuclear operations at the Sendai plant on Kyushu in 4 years, even though the population energetically expressed its opposition. A small number of Japanese politicians thus made the decision to launch Japan's nuclear power plants, despite intense and increasing volcanic and seismic activity. And yet, as we have shown, the epidemiological, residential, and psychological effects of nuclear power cannot be managed. So one must question what drives the determinations to persist on this path. It seems that the only remaining motivation is the ultimate power, the right of life or death over the whole of the Earth's ecosystem. This quasi-divine right assumed by certain politicians is bolstered by an institutional system that contains enough safety valves to allow the strongest tensions to escape along the margins and ensure that the current system, democratic in name only, is self-sustaining. ありがとうございます。ご清聴ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございました。相原さんのお話との続きで。
Thank you very much. So, the very important points were mentioned, and if you have any questions for clarification, please go ahead.
はい。
大変
Thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. Towards the end, you were talking about the arms and weapons industry and its relation with the nuclear power industry. And you were talking about this exhibition in France and how these companies are participating there. Just a few days ago, the Japanese government officially participated for the very first time participated in such arms exhibition. I think you know that. And recently also Keidanren made a recommendation that as a national policy they should think about the arms export. There has been many mentions, but this was really the first time that Keidanren had made such clear announcement. And we were talking about the need for other perspective than the natural science, so the need for philosophy for the problem solving currently. Well, I am economist, I'm a macroeconomist. And from that perspective as well, I believe that the citizens need to have a shared understanding of the expert knowledge of macroeconomics in this field so that we could all think about the alternative economy and of the government. And that also covers the nuclear power, that also covers the securities law that we're talking about, because all the roots of the issues are, I believe, all same. What do you think about this? I would like to have your opinion. Well, obviously, the problem that is in front of us is clearly the issue of economics, and behind that there is politics. Politics is needed really to push and support the economics. Science is also used behind the politics. So this is the system that we are currently seeing in front of our eyes. But in order to understand this system, well, maybe I'm quite a naive person, and I don't think that humans are bad. I would like to believe that inherently humans are good. And having understood economics, and economic system, is it okay that we are sacrificing so many lives? Is it okay that so many people are dying? Maybe it's our turn next to be ill. What kind of motivation is there to incite certain people to act in this way in society? And in order to try to find that answer, I believe we need to seek in the sphere of philosophy.
Additionally, I'm not saying let's study the economics. That's not what I'm saying. We have to some understanding about this political science. So the backbone of the government, Keidanren, is behind the government. So I'm not saying that Keidan is bad. It's just their interest of Keidanren. Well, as for that, well, let's take it up at the round table. I just like you to confirm the fact, okay? So please stop. So focus on profitability based on the sacrifice of other people, and we do export of the arms. So that's how we're going to do. So I just ask you to stop. But the reason is that, first of all, I just want to clarify the facts in this presentation. Second, this is a very important topic. I would like to take it up at the round table rather than rushing off to make a conclusion. Please understand.